Welcome to our second event of the 2023 Island Feminism Speaker Series. My name is Noralis Rodriguez-Cos, Assistant Professor in Women's and Gender Studies at Gonzaga University. We want to first recognize the traditional homelands of the Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, and Kalispel indigenous people, original communities from the place where this presentation is physically hosted in Spokane, Washington. For those of you that are joining the series for the first time, this is a space for scholars and activists working in island and feminist studies to spark collaboration and interdisciplinary dialogue on social justice for island and islanders. This presentation is being recorded and will be archived on our website for the public to watch and to be used as an educational resource. I want to also thank our attendees that are connected from different parts of the world and my collaborator in this project, Dr. Marina Carides from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Today, our presenter is Dr. Eva Silot Bravo, a creative Afro-Cuban female migrant mother, independent scholar, communicator, educator, and former international negotiator and diplomat in the United Nations. She is currently a Spanish faculty and mentor at the Branson School in Ross, California since July 2021, where she teaches Spanish and cultural studies classes and co-designed and taught a class on female and non-binary creative voices from the African diaspora. Former visiting assistant professor in Spanish and cultural studies at the Modern Languages Department, University of Miami, and adjunct faculty in the humanities and Spanish at Berry University in Miami, Florida. She holds a PhD in cultural studies, Spanish and literatures from the University of Miami, a master's in international studies from Florida International University, a bachelor in international relations, and a degree in piano and classical music. She also has experience as an international legislator and diplomat in the United Nations, a blogger, and an independent journalist, and an arts advocate. Her research and teaching interests include Cuban music and transnational Cuban alternative music scene, narratives of identity, nationalisms and transnationalism, post-national and post-socialist narratives, alternative cultural networks, and popular music. Eva is on the process to publish the book Cuban Fusion, the transnational Cuban alternative music scene. We pick up now at the start of the program.
Cuban government, all the politics that were in place by the Cuban government also shape the post-colonial legacy in particular ways. And it reinforced the centrality of national identity because identity was, in this case, controlled by the officiality, the official narratives of the Cuban nation. And then as an opposition, the Cuban diaspora became the other one against which the Cuban nation defined itself and Cuban nationals. But in both cases, what I find that is important when it comes to the post-colonial legacy is the predominance of white patriarchy and binary narratives, which became, I think the main conditions to think about the modern Cuban experience, I think. And that, as a result, it creates otherness and the marginalization of other subjects, as in many other nations that were not that part of the official narratives or the dominant narratives, like Afro-Cubans, women, LGBTQ, and dissident voices. So even though in the case of the Cuban Revolution, there were policies in place to supposedly make women part of the new process and give power to women, at the end of the day, what that implied was that women were like working 2 times because they were working in a home and working outside home. But that really didn't, I would say, imply the liberation of women as such. because at the end of the day, patriarchy and the culture of patriarchy was really present and really framed the social relationships in the Cuban context. So as a Cuban, who studied in Cuba and outside Cuba, one thing that really struck me as important and relevant is the intersectionality, the idea of intersectionality, proposed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And for me, it's important because it helped me discover, issues about my interaction as an Afro-Cuban woman within the island and outside the island. And this is one of these questions that even in academia, I was not able to study. And it's a shame that being from the Caribbean, we were not exposed in our academic experience to these important conceptualizations and contributions from scholars, Afro-American scholars, like in this case, Kimberly Crenshaw. And what she proposed is it helps understand the experiences of Black women when she says that Black women sometimes experience discrimination in ways similar to white women's experiences. Sometimes they share very similar experiences with Black men. Yet often they experience double discrimination, the combined effects of practices which discriminate on the basis of race and on the basis of sex. So among all the different actors that were marginalized in the Cuban context, in the post-colonial Cuban context, I'm particularly interested lately in Black women, and because of all the intersections that Black women are subject to. And that relates, of course, to my personal experience. And it helped me understand my experience, not only as an Afro-descendant person, but also as a woman, but also as a migrant. And it helps me understand, the impact of all my intersections in my personal experience in academia and outside academia, in my personal life. So I think not only for me, but I think this idea proposed by Crenshaw is really fundamental to understand the experience of Black women across the African diaspora. So I think for me it's important. And then in the case of Cuba, this intersectionality has manifested since the 2000s on through different ideas or topics. For example, there has been a process of feminization of poverty, and there have been a growth of institutionalized and domestic gender violence and femicides, and there's a lack of legal protection. Therefore, there are organizations, for the first time ever, observatories of women that are really monitoring outside the institutions. They are monitoring the issues of domestic gender violence and institutionalized gender violence, because they are not institutions that do that in the case of Cuba. Also, in this case, there's a proliferation of independent journalism in dissident groups and female independent groups, which is something kind of unique in the case of Cuba, because there's no civil society. There was no civil society until recently. And also there has been an oppression, arrest, and prohibition to dissent, to do civic protests, and to exercise independent journalism. And as a result, there has been forced migration of dissident and civic activists. So for me, these are the elements that identify what is the post-colonial context of Cuba in the 2000s, and the efforts that the civic society and females and LGBTQs are trying to do to dismantle, the current state of affairs. And when I think about the US, I'm also very concerned about, well, as many others, about the legislative actions that are taking place in Florida in this case, which is a place where I used to live for many years, where I have a lot of people that I know. in order to silence Black and LGBTQ voices, narratives, and history in education, as we all know. There has been legislation put in place to remove major and minors in subjects as critical race theory and gender studies, and they have been banned spending programs and activities that support DEI efforts and curriculum. There has been also efforts by the government to request universities to report on their spending on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. There has been bans on AP African American Studies in high schools, and legislation like Don't Say Gay that prohibit classroom instructions on sexual orientation and gender identity for grades, and review and ban books which contain LGBTQ and anti-racial African American narratives and history. So I think these are issues that also affect Afro descendants, and that has forced Afro-Diasporic women to adapt or to review their agency and what is it that they're going to do in this regard. These are issues that I don't see a lot of conversations going on in my Cuban community, but eventually these are issues that are going to affect everybody or are affecting the educational system. And because of my migrant experience, I think these are issues that are relevant to all migrants, and to me. And then as a response to that, I think that there's a need for a cultural shift, and I think it's going on. And I see that center in my case because I'm interested in the African diaspora. I see that there are a lot of activists and that are considering the African diaspora as this space, central space of activism and of space of encounter, and as a transnational cultural space of resistance, imagination, and activism. And I think one of the questions that I have in this regard is why in the current circumstances it's important to know, study, learn from, and celebrate Afro-descendant women, BIPOC, and LGBTQ creative voices in all disciplines of knowledge across geographies. And another question that I think and that I see kind of emerging from these spaces is what are alternative ways to organize, redefine knowledge production and human life away from existing dominant cultural, ideological, and ecological systems of selection, oppression, discrimination, silencing, and violence, as the ones that are going on in this case with specifically with the African diasporic experience in the US. And again, as I said, I see the African diaspora as this space, or one of the spaces where these movements of imagination, resistance, and activism are taking place. And I see the African diaspora as a shared cultural legacy across the world, as a space of commonalities. And I think I tend to believe that it's a kind of revolutionary space in the sense that it allows the imagination of new forms of life and new forms of resistance and of creating new spaces of existing, for a lot of people whose story have been, the institutions are trying to delete altogether. So me personally, the question that I have at this point is, and that I think a lot of people probably have, is what does it mean to live, teach, write, research, perform, and interact in the world as an Afro-diasporic woman, creative subject, and bodies in the current circumstances? And the answer that I have is resilience. Resilience, I see, is the only way for Afro-diasporic subjects to move forward in these circumstances. And I have adopted that as a personal strategy in my life because of the intersectionalities that I have been living. And I really would like to hear other people what they have to say, but I don't see any other way around it. Thinking forward in how does this resilience translate for me, when I see all the actions or all the movement that are being created either in Cuba or outside Cuba, I think I just throw some ideas that I think are important that I have in mind when I think about these issues that have to do to bring to the table or create your own table in the case of Afro-descendant woman, BIPOC, and LGBTQ, because I think we are in a time that a lot has been said about these issues, and I think it's time for action. It's time to not represent less and allow more other voices to, as you are doing in this space, I think, to narrate their own experiences, to bring their own voices, even though they could be non-academic or non-elaborated. I think it's important at this point to create other spaces, because the ones that we usually have, I don't think they're working. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been here in this situation where, you know, even the histories and narratives of Afro descendants are just threatened to be totally deleted. So I think it's important that, and when I say create your own table, I'm thinking about entrepreneurial efforts, and I'm thinking about all the young people and young women that I see in Cuba with a lot of, you know, I'm very happy about the emerging new voices that are making a lot of initiatives and that are taking spaces, and they are not waiting for an institution. They're just creating their own, you know, online journals or initiatives or observatories in which they are taking the lead, and they are really making a difference when it comes to filling the gap of um, all the actions that institutions are not taking, or national institutions are not able to fill. I also think it's important to engage in difficult but necessary conversations about the impact of the current local, national, and global political context in our personal lives and work environments. Because I understand we don't want to be the whole time talking about problems, but in the other hand, I think there's this policy or this tendency of just talking about comfortable stuff. And when we do that, I think we avoid important and necessary conversations that I think we all need to have. And I'm also always thinking on, I'm trying of doing this, creating action-oriented interdisciplinary coalitions and collaborative projects, like the ones that I think you're doing, for listening, mutual learning, education, and agency across, in my case, I'm interested in Afro-Diasporic communities, aim to empower local voices, communities, and targeted social actors like Afro-descendant women, BIPOC, LGBTQ creatives, and activists and scholars. But these are just some ideas, and I don't have the solution. I don't claim to have the solution for all these problems. I'm just throwing ideas that I have been thinking for a while, that I'm trying to put together, because I think it's important, you know, to move the status quo, right? To move away from the status quo, or from the way that we usually do things. And I think academia is this place that we tend to, when I was there, and when I see some colleagues that tend to kind of preserve the status quo. And I think it's, you know, it's important for a lot of people who are dealing with issues that touches human lives to realize that it's a time to create coalitions, create communities, you know. I don't think it's necessary anymore to do things the way we usually do, and to be content with the way things are when the world is in need of so much of what is going on in academia. And I think we need to bridge, you know, there's a need of bridge, of creating bridges of communication and debates like the ones that you are having today. So I really thank you so much for the opportunity. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. I really like many of these questions you have. I think they're very on point to the moment in which we're living and to these policies that you have mentioned. So I'll be happy to open the floor to our participants for any questions. I think I would like to ask you first, because you talk about empowering and healing. You mentioned voices several times, like empowering local voices, which I think is so important. And I wonder, like in a moment in which many of these policies are trying to silence those voices, right, and make them invisible. Um, so, and you mentioned the importance uh, of resilience. So I wonder how have been, because it's also, some of these policies are new, but at the same, and they also are a threat, right, to expand to other spaces other than Florida. But I was wondering, but it's not new at the same time. Like we have other ways of silencing, we have other ways in which society, you mentioned the status quo, right, not being necessarily the way anymore to do things. um, how have you in the past, and maybe with this present politics, empower and heal, I think, about your own, but also with your communities, or how have you witnessed um, some of these processes of empowering and healing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, I realized that healing has to do a lot with personal efforts, and that it's okay, realizing that it's okay to spend time or being kind with ourselves. I think that's, for me, has been a good first discovery, because in the society we live in, right, we're so used to uh, go, do. And to realize that healing, the process of healing, has to do, first of all, with giving ourselves the space to realize who we are, what we're doing, how we are situated in the world, how can we contribute, to our context. That's, for me, is a first good step. And second is reaching out. I think reaching out of our comfort zones, because I see, and when I was in academia, I saw this tendency, and I always talk to Marina about that, of doing things, some people doing things in particular ways, talking to each other, to the same people always, and not realizing that there are so many actors that are so relevant to what we are doing, that we need to reach out. They need to feel incorporated. They need to they need to feel part of discussions, and they need to be part of initiatives. They need to be part of initiatives. And I think that sensitivity, and I see this in California, at least in UC Berkeley, I see that they're creating, programs in which they are constantly inviting activists and people that are doing, making the work in the communities. And I think we cannot forget that. And also this self-complacency of, the same voices always. I think we need to move away from that. Me, when I was in academia as a student, I had the opportunity to, do panels in which I would invite people from the outside, because for me it was only logical that, that if we are talking about artists or art, to invite these people to the conversations, to be part of it, because they don't even know what's going on. They don't even know what people are doing about their jobs sometimes. And I think these mutual collaborations are important and necessary. And yeah, I think academia needs, I think, to open up to, the actual world, I think. And I don't know more than that, because I'm not, as I'm not part of academia but anymore. But these are my ideas, when I was there, and uh, how I see that it operates, that I think it's important, as initiatives like this ones are really important, to do debates, to do exchange outside the institution, where people feel welcome, where people feel that they have a voice, that their ideas, have space. I think this is essential.
Thank you. Marina or Angela has a question.
I can, aloha, hi, everyone. I have a question or a follow-up. I'm back here in Hawaii, and just to personalize it, a good friend of Eva and I, Zuleka Pena, who is in the public school system in Miami-Dade, is here visiting. Thus, I was delayed at the beach, everyone. I'll be honest. Here she is. Come say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hola.
So,
Hola.
so we've been talking about the situation in Miami, and Feinberg Fisher, where my children went to school. Zuli just explained that they have just taken half the books in the library have been removed, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, right? And the other concern is that the way the system is operating is that the teachers are silenced, right? And it seems, right, if the principals who speak out, they lose their jobs or get moved all the way to Homestead, for example, right? And also in Florida, we know that like our colleagues in higher education are also being slammed in terms of what they can teach and not teach, and I don't know directly what's going on there, but I guess speaking to what you said, Eva, about like making relationships with the community, including people who are on board for this silencing, but they probably just don't even know why they're on board in some instances. And I guess the biggest thing for me is how do we, me in Hawaii, let's say, or wherever you are in California or Norales in Washington, or how do our organizations, even our professional organizations, support the people on the ground in Florida, right? I mean, I think I guess I'm wondering if any of you know of any kind of national movement that is, especially in terms of thinking and academic work from K through college, that we're lending support, or have we left you all hung to dry, so that's, I guess that's my comment or question in terms of, Eva, you in particular, like, where do we enter if we formed an organization, and Norales in terms of our island feminism as being a project that is committed to activism? What do we do? Like, where do we start, or how, maybe should we start is the first question. Shouldn't we start?
And what would be the repercussions of that for you guys?
We won't,
Because-
but we wouldn't, I think, right? Like for
Right.
me, there's no repercussions for me. I don't
Yeah.
know about, and I don't think for Norales either where she is, but she can speak for herself, but
But I heard you say earlier that teaching the communities about what's actually going on and how it's going to affect and impact the local communities, that's important too.
Yeah.
Because if we're silenced, but we can activate our communities to go ahead and speak up for us. And that's really what our unions, the teachers unions, are doing. That's the approach, because a direct confrontation with the supposedly new legislature that's coming on is going to be a hard direct repercussion for us all. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the community can rise for us
yeah.
if we
Yeah, I
teach
think,
them well.
this is the moment that all the liberals, that are been saying that they support, I think it's a testing moment for liberals people in the educational system and outside. And I believe a lot of people probably are worried because they just want to save the works. But I think, if people are aware of the bigger context, people should be really educating others about what is going on. And we don't have anybody, I think anybody claim to have the answer, but at least, coalitions should be put in place as efforts of, dialogue should be in place, at least. I don't know.
Right.
I'm far away from that. I know it's scary because the last time that I went there, a lot of people expressed to me how concerned they were, about the climate.
Oh, that's good.
Mhm.
I mean, that they were concerned, right?
Yeah.
I've been in conversation with a few, with the women and gender studies conversation, and engaging in different conversations with colleagues here in Washington. And one of them sent me this link, and I haven't read the whole thing, I have to say, but there was a post-strike coalition at the New School. This is the New School in New York City. And the article, which is published in Throughout, it's called Throughout, discusses how the students and faculty are pushing a radical new cooperative university model, right? So
wow.
I think in a way, what you're saying, Eva, of thinking outside of the box, and when you talk about resilience, is those moments, right? Like that people that kind of wait for things to change, that really we have to think outside of the box, otherwise everybody will be silenced or things will get even worse, right? So in times of needs, people get creative. and,
Mhm.
and so maybe this is a calling, right? Like I have to look more into the article, but this is a calling of a different kind of university, that the model as it is right now, he has been designed, as you mentioned earlier, right? That historical aspect of patriarchal whiteness is not working anymore, right? It leaves space for situations like this one to take place and to be a threat for people to be again, perceived as those that should be silenced forever. So we need to think about maybe a different kind of institution that moves away from that corporate model, and really think things through, right? Like what is education for?
Most importantly, for who?
And for who?
Yeah.
No, and I will say in, the case, because I'm always thinking about my Cuban culture, even though I'm kind of far away. And I know in the case of my Cuban people, we are so concerned about what is going on in Cuba, which of course there's, we should be, because it's our land, our country, our island. But I think that has been to the expenses of not paying really attention to what is going on in Florida, which is a second home for many of us. And the things that we're claiming for Cuba to improve or to get better, we are not having the same lens when it comes to, what is going on in Florida. And I think we need to be consistent, and I know probably it's too much to ask to us. I left. That was my answer. So probably I'm not the right person to talk about this, but it doesn't mean because I'm away that I don't think about these questions, and I know it's challenging, but it really tests what is it that we want for education and for, when it comes to politics and when it comes to justice and social justice, because that has to be across the board, the same values that we are defending in Cuba, we should defend here, I think. But again, as I say, I left. That was my answer, to what was going on over there, because I couldn't find a space at the end. I tried to create my own spaces, but really there was a lot of resistance to that. So, but I think that the situation is really calling for new spaces, new ways, as you said. I agree with you, of doing things. and to imagine, education, because we are so caught up into defending our jobs and the status quo that I'm hanging out with the same people, doing the same things, doing the same panels, talking to the same people, that I don't think really, we're doing much to deal with this, with what is going on.
Yeah, if you look at the broader picture too, DeSantis is not just running Florida, he is going to be running for president. So, we're looking at a person who's got a lot of power amongst, his followers. And I think it's important that if we're focusing on what his policies are in Florida, that we can, at least try to prevent him from moving on forward to becoming our next president, because hey, there is power in numbers. And if we don't respond to him for what he's doing in Florida,
Right.
that's just his next level to, bring it to the nation,
Right.
And he is the favored one at the moment. Trump is no longer the favored one, especially everyone in Florida is looking at him as the next president candidate.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like what we were talking about are the steps that are being taken in Florida are the steps of fascism, right? And it's very, very clear. And and even in, totalitarian control, however conceived, right? And so I think what you just said is really important, is that I can state Hawaii has some really great policies, let's say, right? For it improved its access to abortion after Roe versus Wade went down, right? It reaffirmed its position on LGBTQ and trans people, right? So maybe with that, it's our job now to support our colleagues in Florida, because if we can't, it's like a disease, right? If we don't deal with Florida, just not even because he's running for president or whatever, because it's Florida and books are being taken out of the libraries that our kids went to school in, then we're all doing like what you were saying, Eva, the sort of liberal positioning, I think. But I guess I have been, thinking, I guess with some more time on my head of where what do I, where do I join, or what do I help facilitate, or where do I interject in terms of like writing the principal, where our kids went to school, and saying, hey, I'm really disappointed that you took all those wonderful books from the library. Okay, that's a small little thing, but
Yeah.
I think in terms of like, it's got to be a bigger movement.
Yeah, writing.
In the Chronicle of Higher Education yesterday, there was news posted about a professor in Florida who was rejected, terminated, because of an issue that a parent raised on a class that he has been teaching for 13 years on social justice. So when we mention this, what we're talking really is the history of Afro-American voices.
Right.
So if we don't want to know about the history of Afro descendants, what do we want to know about? And this is happening, it's happening. The guy was just terminated. So I think every day we read something new that is happening in our own backyard about how much fascism is gaining momentum. And I think we need to really be very vigilant and figure out ways, I guess, collectively, with people who are expert or not experts, activists and not activists, and forget about those, divisions that we are so used to and we like to have, and figure out collectively how we're going to move forward and how we're not going to allow this happening, because it's happening through the legislative process. But I believe, I don't know, I want to believe that the tradition of activism in this country is gonna kick in when it comes to this. I want to be optimistic because, you know, I come from Cuba and I have seen enough of the other extreme. So probably I don't want to believe that this is happening here, but it's happening. So, but still, I have learned a lot from activism in this country. So I think this is the moment that, you know, activism has to be in place everywhere to all levels.
Mhm.
Well, many questions, right, with no easy solutions. But hopefully, like you say, I think it's a moment for also activism to start taking new forms, maybe new creative forms again, and something to think about, right? Like, how can we move beyond our home institutions or our little worlds and think about Florida as something that is happening in our backyard, because it is.
Mhm.
So I appreciate, Eva, your presentation. I think it's very important in this particular moment, and in other moments too. I think your work is excellent.
Thank you.
I thank you for being here today.
Thank you again for the invitation or for the dialogue. I appreciate it.